All right, my name is Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined once again by Matthew McManus, a political theorist, professor at Spelman College in Atlanta, and my co-editor on this book, which is out today, Analytical Marxism and Democratic Socialism in the 21st Century, revisiting G.A. Cohen, which has been a very, very, very long time coming.
Yeah, that's for sure. I still don't have the physical copy in my hand, so I think I'll truly believe it when I'm holding it. But I'm very proud of the volume. We have some great good like contributions, and it's pretty ideologically eclectic. Also, you have some liberals, you have some socialists. There's a libertarian. So even if you're not into analytical Marxism or democratic socialism, there'll probably be something for you in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, we do have a libertarian in there, Chris Freeman, to add a little bit of ideological diversity to the lineup. We also figured that since Cohen spent so much of his life arguing with libertarians, right, that should be somewhere in that conversational lineup. Mostly there are people who are leftists or such, of one stripe or another. But certainly there are a variety of views about the man himself and his work, right? There's a range of perspectives there. I've often referred to Cohen as the patron saint of this podcast. But he given
Every
given the
time one
sort
of your
of
guests tries to do an impression of
the
someone,
way.
he comes down and blesses it.
Yeah, exactly. uh yeah, so yeah, I mean, given the way that he combined analytic philosophy and Marxist theory, which is obviously a combination that's very close to my heart. And yes, he was also very, very funny. There's you could find on YouTube any number of impressions that he did. Maybe we'll play you one or two later. So this is all, obviously he the first years of YouTube were the last years of his life. He was a very old man, but I have often thought that he would have killed on YouTube had he survived long enough to fully take advantage of the medium. I remember uh, playing one of Cohen's impressions, right? So these are things that these are just like home videos from, like, I don't know, the 80s and 90s. It's like, John Romer's living room or whatever. That somebody takes, you know somebody has a camcorder, and Cohen's doing funny impressions. They take him doing them. I remember playing one to the late Michael Brooks in 2019, and Michael telling me that it made him a little bit mad that Cohen wasn't still alive, so he couldn't book him on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Would have killed on the circuit, right? It's also nice because, once upon a time, I think this is less true now, but there was this impression people had of leftists as being kind of dour, self-righteous, probably good-hearted, but, not exactly very humor-filled people. And Cohen just kind of blasted those cliches to smithereens, right? He was a really funny guy. He was very warm, very affable. And like you said, I think we all lost something when he died prematurely back in the 2000s.
Yeah, no, for sure. Although, yeah, I mean, obviously, I want to get into to the meat of the guy's work in this episode, where we talk a little bit about what is in the new book out today. Uh, so I should say, though, to kind of get a sense of to get a sense of the man and what drove him, right? Cohen for anybody who's watching this, who's not familiar, grew up in a family with of Communist Party members and fellow travelers in Montreal, Jewish working class, communist environment. Over the kind of over the course, like as a young man, kind of over the course of the 50s and 60s, he became disillusioned with the Soviet Union in the ways that lots of socialist intellectuals at the time were. Kind of culminating for him, like in with the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 as the place where he decided that like he could no longer defend this at all. But unlike, of course, some people who made that who made that turn, he never sort of renounced the socialist ideals that had been instilled in him in youth, or for that matter, his interest in Marxism as an explanatory framework. And so, long after all that, right, long after kind of giving up the ghost of Soviet apologism, in the late 70s, he comes out with a book called Karl Marx's Theory of History, a defense, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's it's a defense of Marx's historical materialism, and that really, it's, as with all such things, trying to say this is the definitive starting point is always a little silly, because you always have different people who are working on the same tracks. You always have predecessors, but that's more or less the founding document of what would become known as analytical Marxism.
I should also add, for people who haven't checked this book out, there are a lot of criticisms you can make of Karl Marx's theory of history, a defense. I've given some, you've given some, etc. But even Roger Scruton, the arch-conservative philosopher of the late 20th century, described Karl Marx's theory of history as offering the most persuasive and powerful defense of historical materialism he'd ever read. So don't take it from us that's a worthwhile book to read. Even conservatives or conservative philosophers, back when they did actually read books, found a lot of value in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a few years ago, researching the book that I wrote about Christopher Hitchens, I remember reading a like mid-2000s exchange that Hitchens did with some of his left critics, where one of them had said something like, well, Hitchens has rejected the sort of dogmatic Marxist determinism of his past beliefs, but now he believes something equally ridiculous, etc. And Hitchens, mid-2000s, right? All sorts of terrible political positions. Right. And this is War on Terror Hitchens. Pauses in the middle of the defense to be like, actually, also, that's a little bit of an exaggeration of Marxist historical materialism. If you want a more nuanced view, you should read Karl Marx's Theory of History and Defense by G.A. Cohen. So I think that book, I think that book impressed a lot of people over the years, and so it kind of became the founding document of what's been called analytical Marxism, which I think sometimes people get a little bit the wrong idea when they think about the history of analytical Marxism. So there was something called the September Group, which was like an annual meeting with Cohen, Eric Olin Wright, John Romer, John Elster, Robert Brenner was at a lot of these, like various other people. And so you have, like people, so, okay, you have a group, you have a label. And so I think that leads a lot of people to think that you're talking about people who like basically, at least in broad strokes, agreed with each other. Mm-hmm. And that's actually, wildly misleading. There were like figures within this group, of course, did sometimes agree with each other and influence each other's views, but just as often they disagreed about every possible topic of Marxist theory or normative political philosophy you can imagine, right? Like what they had in common was what made their Marxism analytical Marxism was a methodological commitment, right? All right.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to pause there and say that.
Wonder what's going on.
Yeah, your internet's a little choppy.
Yeah. All right, let's try that. Sorry, you were saying?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of different reasons to criticize specific figures in analytical Marxism. But since that's in the title of our book, maybe it's worth pausing to talk a little bit about what methodologically distinguish analytical Marxism from other streams of Marxism. Because I think there are a couple of cliches that it's worth kind of pushing back against. Probably the biggest single cliche that I see lobbed at analytical Marxism is that analytical Marxists essentially conceded a lot to bourgeois methods of social scientific analysis, and not to mention bourgeois ethics, right? So they kind of liberalized Marxism in certain kinds of ways. Now, in fairness, right, it is true that some analytical Marxists, like Elster, right, use rational choice paradigms to try to famously make sense of Marxism, and many of us don't really think that that actually made a great deal of sense of Marxism. And of course, Cohen, as I'm sure we'll get into, was willing to dialogue with Rawls, Nozick, et cetera, and others in a way that was pretty unusual for most Marxists at the time. But what I think really distinguishes the analytical method of Marxist analysis is less the willingness to draw upon bourgeois methods specifically, so much as a willingness to draw on any number of different methods in order to make sense of Marxism. There's this real ecumenicism and open-mindedness about what it meant to be a Marxist in the analytical paradigm. And associated with this, I think what's also admirable about analytical Marxists was how they're willing to actually be quite critical of Marx and Marxism if they felt that he or they had made mistakes in the past. A good example of this would be Cohen's really quite seminal reworking of the labor theory of value, or the theory of exploitation, which we can get into later. But Cohen says, look, it's not like there's nothing to this Marxist idea of exploitation. Marx probably just made certain mistakes in understanding what exactly was entailed by the idea. So let's rework it, let's refine it to try to make it plausible in a context where at least classical versions of the labor theory of value don't really seem all that persuasive to most people, even some Marxists, any longer. So I really think at its best, analytical Marxism was admirable for these two reasons, right? This willingness to draw on different philosophical, different methodological and social scientific paradigms to try to rework Marxism, and a willingness to be internally critical of certain Marxist dogmas, even if that frankly hurt people's feelings. And I really think that that's something we should take to heart. I think it's the right way to approach things in a lot of ways.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so yeah, I think that oftentimes people who are Marxists, who might know a little bit about analytical Marxism, and they know who some of the big figures are, will do this thing where they'll kind of take particular views advocated by particular people in this tradition and say, okay, analytical Marxism says X, right? And that's wrong because of Y and Z. Therefore, analytical Marxism is wrong. And I think that there's a really basic misunderstanding there, right? That that what united this, like the reason that we can apply the same label to G.A. Cohen and Eric Olin Wright and John Romer, and for most of his career, John Elster and et cetera, right, is not that they came to the same conclusions, right? It's that they had shared ideas about Marxist methodology. So basically, what those ideas are, largely consist of the idea that that if you're going to try to establish Marxist conclusions, you have to do that with the usual argumentative and analytical methods, used by everybody else, right? By bourgeois social scientists and analytic philosophers and et cetera, right? That in other words, that if we're interested in looking at evidence, thinking through empirical models for empirical premises of our arguments, if we're interested in rigorously clarifying concepts, or thinking about the inferential relationships between parts of our arguments, then the sort of most rigorous intellectual methods that are available for those are the most rigorous intellectual methods that are available for everybody. And Marxists don't have some special Marxist way of figuring out what's true, right? I mean, that's really the core of what differentiates analytical Marxism from from other kinds of Marxism, right? That sort of see the episode we did a little while back with Michael Lazarus. That is there, people will very often claim that that there's something called the dialectical method, which is this special sort of Hegelian Marxist way of finding out of finding out the truth, of coming up with proper analyses. And somebody like Cohen or Eric Olin Wright or any of these people is going to be very very suspicious of that. They're going to say, okay, well, what exactly do you mean? It's certainly in my experience when people start to unpack what they mean, oftentimes they end up not talking about method at all. They end up making sort of metaphysical claims about reality, and even, that, everything is in sort of a constant state of flux. You talk about, the working out of contradictions, etc. So maybe the methodology would be sort of be attentive to these features of reality, or it's so vague in general. It's really hard, at least for me, right, to extract very much specific content from it. And of course, you can. This is all consistent, with thinking that like there's sort of Hegelian dialectical language that identifies real things, and that there is real value to being attentive to those things. But you can like thinking that that doesn't necessarily mean that you think that you're in possession of a unique method of finding the truth, right? So some of like a kind of successor book to Karl Marx's Theory of History, written by Eric Olin Wright, Andrew Levine, and Elliot Sober, Reconstructing Marxism. They've got a nice passage about this in there. They say this is not, after saying a lot of what I just said, they say this is not to say that all of the specific elements traditionally included under the expression Marxist method should be rejected out of hand. The point is that in order to be useful, such elements have to be translated into a language of causes, mechanisms, and effects, rather than left as elusive philosophical principles. Take the notion of contradiction, a key element of the purported dialectical method. One way of explicating this concept in conventional causal language is to treat a contradiction as a situation in which there are multiple conditions for the reproduction of a system, which cannot all of which cannot be simultaneously satisfied. Alternatively, a contradiction can be viewed as a situation in which the unintended consequences of a strategy subvert the accomplishment of its intended goals. Or finally, a contradiction can be viewed as an underlying social antagonism which produces conflicts. And if a social relation has certain properties which have an intrinsic tendency to generate conflict, one might say the conflict is generated by a contradiction. There may be advantages or disadvantages to each of these formulations. In all these cases, however, contradiction is not treated as this philosophically driven way of interpreting the essence of a process, but a way of explicating the intricacies among a set of causal mechanisms. This kind of translation of an element of Marxist method into language of causal mechanisms is essential if the explanations generated using the element are to be scientifically intelligible. So, this is the one kind of sloganistic way of thinking about all this is that, if you want to do Marxism in an intellectually respectable way, given the sort of developments in philosophy and the social sciences in the last century and a half or so, that rather than kind of saying that there's this special Marxist way of going about things, that we've got the secret decoder rings that let us see the secret nature of things. That you said, no, look, I mean, if you think the sort of basic insights of Marxism still hold up, or a lot of them do, maybe you have to revise other points, then you're down on all fours with everybody else using the same methods to figure things out in the same way, right? So, Karl Marx's theory of history is an attempt to do that for defending the sort of key elements of Marx's historical materialism. It's a really brilliant book. It's hard to sort of quickly evoke everything that's going on in that book, but as everybody from Matt McManus to Roger Scruton, would agree, it's worth your time it's worth your time to grapple with it. And and also I think because in that book Cohen is trying as hard as he is to be clear and precise about the elements of the classical Marxist theory of history to defend them. I think it also had the end result of lots of people, sort of seeing, okay, it leads to a lot of productive disagreements, right, in the decades after that, right? It's like, okay, well, actually, so now that you've laid it all out, this is where I think it goes wrong, and no, it's actually here, and you can have a much more interested discussion than you were having before then.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I should add includes Cohen disagreeing with himself about Karl Marx's theory of history near the end of his life. So a couple of things I just wanted to say before we move on to the kind of substance of his views, although we're already gesturing towards that. I think that one of the reasons why people have some reservations about analytical Marxism isn't just about the method applied and its kind of bourgeois connotations, but about the conclusions that people reach, right? There's this kind of suspicion that analytical Marxists, because they're willing to dialogue with Nozick or draw upon rational choice theory, et cetera, inevitably end up being less politically radical in terms of their substance of their views than certain counterparts. And just to name names, this is kind of the accusation that Scheringa makes in his recent book, A Social History of Analytical Philosophy, where he charges Cohen being essentially a watered-down Marxist, right? Somebody who isn't really committed. And that's just not true, right, in terms of the substance of what these figures argue for. If anything, it's hard to imagine somebody who is putting forward a more radical rethinking of what society should look like than G.A. Cohen, certainly in terms of the level of egalitarianism and equality that he expects a just society would have to instantiate. Not to mention, some of his quite interesting views about what grounds are ethical views, metaethically, right? So the analytical Marxists, you can take as much issue as you want with certain kind of methodological claims they make, with their use of rational choice theory, with Cohen's willingness to cede a lot to somebody like Rawls. But you definitely can't charge analytical Marxists, and you certainly can't charge Cohen with not being sufficiently committed to the cause of a quite transformative democratic socialism. So I just want to make that very, very clear, right, for anyone who might have some lingering skepticism on that point. Okay, sorry, you want to say something?
Yeah, I should also say the rational choice theory thing is kind of funny, because I think that people who do tend to see this not just as a sort of like the branch of Marxist theory happening within certain methodological assumptions, but as like a school of thought united by common views, tend to assume that rational, even though this is a methodological question, right? They tend to assume that rational choice theory is something that all these people have in common. And of course, Cohen himself actually was quite critical of use of rational choice theory in Marxist theory by some of his fellow analytical Marxists. He was not a fan of rational choice theory. There's also this funny thing where, because I think it's because it's one of the few documents where like a major figure is sort of laying out like what he takes to be the core of analytical Marxism, and so therefore, understandably, critics pay a lot of attention to it. In the introduction to in Cohen's introduction to the 2000 edition of Karl Marx's Theory of History, he has, he spends a few pages sort of laying out what analytical Marxism is, what its history was. And he's
also just anecdotally worth noting that apparently one of the catalysts for this transition on Cohen's part was Althusser and reading Althusser. He was not a fan, and he felt that a lot of the claims made by Althusser and his school were incoherent, taken on their own terms, and decided that he could do better. Now, this I think is at least somewhat unfair, because I happen to think that there's a lot of virtue in Althusser's reading of Capital, even though I definitely do not think it is accurate in terms of what Marx himself was getting at. But just to provide a little bit of historical contrast there for people who are familiar with that particular school of Marxist thought.
Yeah, so in this introduction, Cohen says all analytical Marxists are analytic in a broad sense, some are analytic in a narrow sense, and the broad sense is more or less what I just laid out. The narrow sense is like you're trying to like analyze things in the sense of breaking down like large things into small components. And it says, well, this leads some of them to this commitment to methodological individualism, right? You can only like a complete theory of a social phenomena has to ground out, right, in theories about the incentives and motivations of individuals. And it's really funny that, like, I feel like once every couple of years, right, there'll be an article somewhere like that there'll be that there'll be some kind of one of these like kind of quasi-popular, quasi-academic Marxist magazines that'll put things like this out. There'll be an article denouncing analytical Marxism, and all of them always use this as like their big source, and all of them always miss the fact that Cohen, even when he's being very neutral, he's not speaking for himself, right? In that introduction, right, says, well, some of them all are also analytical in this narrow sense, and they completely miss that Cohen himself was a big critic of methodological individualism, right? Like they just sort of take this as, oh, see, these are the two things all analytical Marxists believe.
No, absolutely, and again, I think that that's a consequence of this cliche, which holds that what distinguished analytical Marxism was a willingness to bourgeoisify itself, right? To bourgeoisify Marxism. And again, there is no doubt that analytical Marxists were more willing to dialogue with liberal political philosophy, liberal ways of doing social science. But dialogue does not mean take on board uncritically. In fact, if anything, people like Cohen were often very critical of certain bourgeois assumptions that work their way into political philosophy, etc. Okay, so that's a good way to transition then. So just to provide a little bit of summary for those who are unfamiliar with Cohen's oeuvre, which I'm guessing at least is a few people, by and large, his work is divided or periodized into two parts. The first one is largely defined by the book that we've already been discussing, Karl Marx's Theory of History, which came out in the late 1970s and is really the premier starting point for defending historical materialism from an analytical standpoint. And we can devote a little bit of time to discussing the merits of the book and some of the criticisms that have been lobbed at it, again, not least by Cohen himself, who revised many of the arguments he made in earlier versions of Karl Marx's Theory of History by the end of his life. But then the second period is the one that I personally focus on in my contribution to this collection, which is a very interesting period where he tries to argue from a moral standpoint for a democratic socialist theory of justice. And this involves dialogues with, as you mentioned, figures like Nozick in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Rawls, Dworkin, many other people who are bigwigs in analytical philosophy. But what's also very interesting about this period is while Cohen doesn't necessarily present a system or a theoretical system defending democratic socialist justice, there's a lot of core principles that he defends very articulately and very well, that any person who's interested in defending democratic socialism in the 21st century is going to want to think long and hard about, because there's no one who was a better defender of the morality of democratic socialism, I would argue, than G.A. Cohen.
Yeah, so this is so I'd say not, from my perspective. I mean, yeah, I think that there. So I want to be a little careful about the periodization. So I think that I think it's certainly true that there's a period where a greater chunk of his energy is devoted to one of these things, and there's a period where a greater chunk is devoted to the other, right? There's no doubt about that. Part of the point I was trying to make in my own essay about this is that I think people will often construct these narratives around that about he saw that the historical materialism didn't work, right? So he sort of gave up on the historical inevitability of socialism and started making moral arguments for it or whatever, which quite aside from the fact that I don't necessarily think that a plausible version of historical materialism makes any particular claims of historical inevitability. It's also part of the sort of simple point I was trying to make in my contribution in our volume is that these were always going on, right? These were always parallel tracks, right? In his thinking, right? He was, in fact, like some of his like most notable early engagement with Nozick, the essays that are collected in this book, Self-Ownership, Freedom and Equality, were actually written before the publication of Karl Marx's theory of history, and all of the, obviously, his views didn't stand still over time. He was engaging with all these very smart people you just said. It'd be really weird if nothing that any of them said ever moved him on anything or made him rethink any point. But I think in broad strokes, right? I mean, his the normative views that are in here are pretty similar to the normative views that you get in, for example, his little book "Why Not Socialism," which apparently was which was in kind of one of the last things he did, was preparing that thing for publication, right? It's in fact, something I found out at the event we did at York from Christine Sipnowich is that apparently it actually came out on the day that he died, right? So I think there is quite a bit of continuity in his normative views over the years. But yeah, however much of these things took up his energy at any given time, he was always interested in both of these things, right? That both arguing for historical materialism, although I think it's also fair to say that some of the stronger claims that he'd made on its behalf, he had walked back to some extent, right? In the last, in the later decades of his life, he was moved by some of the criticisms of some versions of some of the claims that he'd made for that. And he was also always interested in making normative arguments about the desirability of socialism, right? So he said about the libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick that he'd always kind of vaguely assumed, right? I mean, Cohen had spent all these years studying philosophy. He'd spent as much time as anybody sort of in academic context thinking about moral philosophy, but he'd always vaguely assumed that sort of any halfway plausible moral theory would combined with reasonable empirical premises would get you to support for socialism. And he said that reading Nozick awoke him from his dogmatic socialist slumber and made him realize that certain things that he just thought were obvious actually required a rigorous defense, and he was interested in doing that for for quite a bit of his life. From my perspective, I'd certainly say that I think that the demolition of Nozick is very thorough, right? I mean, sort of brick for brick, like nothing is left. I think later on, he becomes really interested in arguing with Rawls, who's Rawls's theory of justice is something.
Well,
that
here,
I think.
why don't we pause there, though, because I do want to talk a little bit about his defense of historical materialism before we really dive in to the stuff on his different ethical engagements, just so that we don't kind of overwhelm with information, right? So I have one point out. I absolutely agree with you, right? I think that you don't have to, it can be very, very easy to kind of over periodize his work. He was already writing about things like the structure of proletarian and freedom in 1983, and I think that's one of his best essays on moral philosophy, when he points out that a lot of people are deeply unfree in capitalism or under capitalism, and for people who care about freedom, which should include socialists, that's a really bad thing, right? But focusing on that book for a little while, right? This book makes a number of really quite seminal claims about Marx's theory of history. Most not notably, right? It extrapolates a great deal from Marx's contribution to a critique of political economy and takes as the essence of Marx's historical materialist philosophy, the argument that you see in the preface to that book about relations of production, forces of production, base superstructure, et cetera, et cetera. So why don't we talk a little bit about how Cohen reconstructs that, and then maybe we can move on to his later thoughts on inclusive and restrictive historical materialism, and then we'll move on to talking a little bit about his later dialogues with people like Nozick, Dworkin, et cetera. Does that work for you?
Sure. So yeah, in Marx's Marx's 1859 preface is a preface to Contribution and Critique of Political Economy, which I know the preface to a contribution. So the larger work is called A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, and I know if you keep saying his preface to a Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy, that's a bit of a mouthful, which is why it's usually just referred to as the 1859 preface. And in that document, right, this is he has basically what Marx does is he traces his own intellectual development from being a Hegelian to thinking, to having a materialist perspective about history, and they have and he has these famous paragraphs, right? In the social relations of production, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage of the development of their material forces of production. The total of these relations of production constitute the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arise a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. And then it goes on like that. And this, I think, is important to Cohen, but important to a lot of people, because it's kind of Marx's clearest statement of his theory of history, especially his sort of clearest published statement during his life, right, of the theory of history, right? There's the you can find other formulations. I mean, I think you can, this is clearly like an important part of Marx's overall package of views. Like you can find like snippets like all over the place where Marx is expressing this. I mean, it's their, it's all over Capital, right? Certainly, you can find it in the Communist Manifesto, right? You can find it all, you can find it, throughout a lot of Marx's most important work. That he'll sort of have a few sentences where he'll kind of like quickly refer to or summarize these views, but those paragraphs in the 1859 preface I think are important because other than stuff like the German ideology, which is even sort of calling it the German ideology as if like this were a book that had that title or whatever is a little bit anachronistic. It's a little bit stitched together, right? From different manuscripts, and that was that's not like something that Marx, thought was going to be published.
It's also a pretty hilarious book because if you read it, the first couple chapters are very interesting. There's a lot of deep stuff on German ideology, on historical materialism, critique of idealism, etc. But the vast majority of that book, because Marx was a truly great Hegel, is taken up with the critique of Steiner and just a relentless pile-driving critique of Steiner. And for people who are not familiar with Steiner, that's perfectly fine. But I would say that that's a good reason to avoid picking it up because unless you really want to read Marx in one of his angriest modes, where he just decided to dedicate months to showing why this one person is wrong, probably better to kind of put that aside.
Yeah, yes, certainly one of the all-time great haters. Something I learned from Vanessa Will's book is that Marx also had a hundreds of pages long satirical takedown of a bunch of people in the radical German expat community called Heroes of the Exile. It's like this just lying around his notebooks, it's yeah. So there's stuff that, so there's German ideology, there's the introduction to the Grundrisse, right, but again, something that he had no thought would ever be published, while he's alive, but as but this is something that he put out there, right? It was sort of the well-known formulation of his views about history. And also, if you really want, I should also say, maybe a little bit more polemically, right? If you actually want a clearly stated theory of history from Marx, this is the clearest thing you can go to, right? I mean, lots of, I think there are lots of sort of academic Marxy types who kind of like to pull out views that they refer to as historical materialism, but don't particularly want to be committed to these claims, right? So they'll kind of de-emphasize this, right? So if all you mean by historical materialism is you're going to think about history and you're going to emphasize material stuff, it's like, okay, fair enough, right? I can't stop you, but but that's pretty generic, right? That's you can sort of pull together, well, I'm going to sort of emphasize economic factors, I'm going to use a lot of dialectic-y language, right? So we're doing historical materialism. But if you want some clear claims that you could agree with or disagree with, this seems like the clearest place to go to. And so in those claims, Marx, whatever else he's saying, right, seems to at least be saying this much, that there's that the relations of production in any given society, in other words, do you have capitalists and workers, do you have lords and serfs, do you have slaves and slave owners, are the foundation on which legal and political institutions are built, right? And
it's important to add later on, because this will become key when we discuss restrictive and inclusive historical materialism. Some have posited that Marx also intended cultural and moral systems and beliefs to be causally determined in this way also.
Yeah. So Marx uses this. So when Marx talks about the base and superstructure, so the base, what he calls the real foundations, are the relations of production. That much is very clear. When Marx uses the term superstructure, he only ever uses it with the phrase legal and political before it, right? So he seems to be specifically thinking about law and government. Later Marxists, people like Althusser, right, would use phrases like the ideological superstructure. Marx doesn't talk that way, although to be fair to those later Marxists, Marx does say things, that seem to at least ambiguously gesture in that direction, right?
Including the German ideology, right? I mean, it's very hard to say, well, actually, no, materiality and material relations constitute thought, not the other way around, right? And read that as not implying that ideology and cultural formations, etc., are probably in some way, shape, or form constituted by forces and relations of production, right? To be clear, I agree with you that I don't think that that's what Marx intended to say, but I just want to be generous to other Marxists who have read that into the Marxist oeuvre.
Yeah, I mean, look, even in the 1859 preface, right? I mean, again, like he does say things that at least ambiguously gesture in that direction. He says, he talks about the political, moral, philosophical, artistic, religious forms in which class struggle expresses itself. Now, I wouldn't take that as Marx saying that every, religious, moral, philosophical, political, etc., artistic, I think that thought everybody ever has expresses class struggle, right? Like I think there's a leap there, right? But I mean,
if any of you are hungry right now or want a beer, you might not know it, but ultimately the class struggle is what's determining those thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that, so I think, but yeah, I do want to be fair here. I do think there is at least a little bit of ambiguity in Marx, because there are some sweeping formulations here that, could definitely be read that way. Maybe not that way, but, they could definitely be read as saying that like everything ends up being superstructural. But at the very least, he thinks sort of basic political and legal institutions of societies tend to, in some sense, be downstream of the relations of production. And he also, this is something that I think many later Marxists have wanted to wiggle out from for many reasons. He also pretty clearly thinks that there's some sense in which relations of production are downstream from the development of the forces of production. This is, in fact, like if you read Bruno Leipold's wonderful book, Citizen Marx, about Marx and republicanism, some of my favorite, one of my favorite chapters of the book is about Marx and Engels's debates with this guy Karl Heinzen, who was like a non-socialist radical Republican critic of his, and a lot of those debates were in fact about Marx's critics like not liking the implication that it was impossible to sort of form a better society until the forces of production were sufficiently developed to form a material basis of that.
And just to give some real world currency to this, in the self-ownership book, when Cohen is talking about the obstetric vision of history, he points out that the fall of the Soviet Union actually confirms Marx's thesis, because, of course, the entire reasoning behind the Marxist-Leninist project and later Stalinist project is you can give history a little bit of a push by putting a communist party in charge, having them develop the forces of production, and then kind of leapfrog your way towards full communism, et cetera, et cetera. And Cohen pointed out kind of slyly that actually the fact that the Soviet economy eventually tumbled and collapsed kind of confirms Marx's sage view that no, there's no leapfrogging that you can do. Actually, you need to make sure that the forces of production are sufficiently developed so that you can then transition to new relations of production characterized by socialism and later communism. So just to kind of put a little bit of a historical meat onto those bones.
Totally, right? So, okay, so that's very, very broad strokes, right? That is Marx's theory of history, that you have that, like, at the very least, and there are stronger versions of these claims, right, that some people have sometimes made, Cohen, right, had sometimes made, right? Mm-hmm. But at the very least, that a certain level of development of the forces of production is sort of necessary for each new stage of history in terms of new relations of production, and that relations of production are in some sense what's upstream of like how the legal and political institutions of society are going to be organized. At the very least, it says that.
Well, I think we should pause here and talk a little bit about Cohen's own reworking of these ideas, just so we don't end up straying too much into talking about Marx generally. Not that that's not interesting. So I think what Cohen contributes, and well, there's a lot of things that he contributes in this book, but one of his seminal contributions in this book is defining the transitions and the causal relations that you're describing in terms of functionalist explanation. And I think that we should really pause to talk a little bit about this, right? So functional explanation. Yeah, functional explanation is really at the heart of how Cohen tries to reconstruct Marx's theory of history. And if you want an example of functional explanation, the one that he gives is, look, if you want to know why it is that birds have hollow bones, it's so they can fly, right? That's functional explanation, right? You explain things in terms of their functions. And similarly, Cohen has sometimes been criticized for overusing this idea of functional explanation when trying to understand Marxism. But I think that he gets a lot of currency out of it, right? By saying, look, if you have a society that is primarily agricultural, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have a society that's going to have something that looks like a slave set of organizations, which is what has typically happened. If you have a society where you have big industrial technologies and the spinning jenny, et cetera, that is probably going to facilitate, or at least lead, or even lead to you ending up with capitalist relations of productions and a capitalist superstructure, right? And again, there's overly rigid and overly deterministic ways of understanding this mode of explanation and the kind of causal claims that he makes that result from it. But I think there's a lot of plausibility, both to what it is that he's talking about, and certainly to the claim that, at least in the preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy, this is the kind of mode of explanation that Marx is giving.
Yeah, right. So I guess like a different way to put that would be to say that, there's clearly some sense in which Marx is suggesting that the arrow of causation is pointing from forces to relations, from relations to superstructure. And some Marxists might be tempted to sort of fudge this by saying, "Oh, see, it's all dialectical. Everything causes everything," right? But like Marx himself seems not to be saying that, right? Marx himself pretty clearly seems to be saying, in some sense, forces therefore relations, therefore superstructure, right? And so then obvious follow-up question, okay, well, what do those causal links look like, right? Like how is one of those things, causing another? And so one of the kind of thing that a lot of Cohen's book, Karl Marx's Theory of History, is dedicated to is worrying about things like, okay, well, hold on. If you're saying that one system, right, one system of relations of production supersedes another because it's better at developing the forces of production, right? That's like, capitalism, supersedes feudalism because capitalism is better at developing the forces of production, for example. Or you're making parallel claims about base superstructure stuff. Isn't the arrow of causation going in the wrong direction, right? Aren't you sort of trying to explain later things? Aren't you trying to explain earlier things by their effect on later things? And is this sort of spooky backward causation? And so Cohen really likes this, as your Hollow Birds example, how Hollow Wings example shows, right? Cohen really likes the metaphor with evolutionary biology, right? Which, of course, we shouldn't stretch too far because,
although it is worth noting that Marx himself constantly referred to Darwin's influence on him. Definitely certain kind of criticisms of the Malthusian modes of analysis that Darwin sometimes applied to nature. But I think that Cohen is on pretty solid ground in trying to draw inspiration from that tradition.
Yeah, right, totally. Marx, dedicated one of the volumes of Capital to Darwin, and he wanted to, right, do so, right? Marx had, I guess it's a little unclear who sent it, but Marx clearly knew about it. He signed it, right? So there's a copy of Capital signed by Marx that he or one of his friends had sent to Darwin, which just fun fact, because the way that Victorian era books worked, you had to like actually like cut open the pages, and so we still have Darwin's copy of Capital, from which you could see from how many pages have been cut that he did not get very far.
Yeah.
But
Well, he was a busy guy.
yeah, fair enough. There's that third chapter, defeats a lot of people. But in any case, yeah, I mean, I think that. So yeah, right. So this is, as you say, it's on very solid sort of Marxist footing here, and he wants to. And so Cohen has, and so like the reason that I sort of corrected functionalist to functional earlier is that there's functionalism, right, as a view like about sort of sociological explanation that Cohen is sort of leery about, saying, oh, so you're saying this, right? And he's like, no, right? Like I'm I have, like functionalism as this much more sweeping view he has worries about, but he does think that functional explanations, right? You're explaining things via their function, is a generally legitimate sort of form of social scientific inference, just as it is in biological science and whatever. And he thinks, and he also thinks, in fact, that like functional explanation can be legitimate even when we're sort of still trying to figure out a lot of the details of the mechanism, right? It's sort of more zoomed in levels,
which
of
is
analysis.
very clear. Which I should say is very clear in this book, right? I mean, it's not a thin volume, right? The one I have is over 500 pages, although that's inclusive of some of the rework chapters. But there are a lot of points in the book where Cohen will say, look, I'm offering a kind of philosophical reconstruction of this text, actually going through the historical details about how feudalism transitioned to capitalism, et cetera, that Marx himself dedicated an enormous amount of time to, right? That's stuff we're all going to put aside here for clarity of exposition. I did just want to talk a little bit, though, about some of the criticisms people have made of this mode of explanation as a kind of build up.
I mean, one of them is what I just said, right? So they have that you're, there are people like, look, I mean, I think it's a tricky issue how much you should be allowed to get away with saying like that. Because it's one thing to say, look, the history of science is full of people figuring out sort of broad causation, when they didn't have a complete theory of the fine-grained details yet, right? Darwin didn't know about genetics. Newton's theory of gravity was, I don't know, God, right? It's oftentimes scientific progress doesn't happen all at once. Oftentimes, we can sort of figure out broad claims about causation before we can fill in a lot of the details. That's all kind of fair as far as it goes. But I think some critics have thought, not unfairly, that like some of the causal details, like, he, really aren't, like, even for what he's doing, even like relative to the fact that he's saying, look, I'm not actually sort of doing the empirical evaluation as further work. I'm like what I'm doing in this book is conceptual clarification. Okay, but even for that project, right? Like one of the criticisms, I think is a fair criticism, right? Is,
oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but you need to give us more than this, right? Like
this is I should add, quite an abstract book, right?
You're saying, but yeah, you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very abstract book that way, right? I mean, for anyone who's bored by reading pages and pages of Capital that are about the production of textiles and about cotton imports, et cetera, this goes very much in the opposite direction, sometimes for the worst, I think, right? But I would say that two of the more enduring critiques, one of which is fair and one of which I think is somewhat unfair, right, is that Cohen was a technological determinist, right? And you already gestured towards this, right? There's this inference that you sometimes get from the book, which I think is also, like I said, true of the initial preface, right? Which is that the forces of production are what ultimately lead to the relations of production, and that is what ultimately determines the superstructure, right? So again, if you have an agricultural community and you're planting seeds, you're going to have a slave society. If you have the spinning jenny, you're going to get a capitalist society. That's the kind of cliche way of framing this. And I think that is deeply unfair to Cohen's reading of historical materialism, which is a lot more nuanced about this, in that respect. But since your essay focuses a lot on this, I figured maybe you could respond to this objection. The other objection I want to talk about that Cohen himself addressed is that historical materialism tries to explain too much, right? And this is what we were already getting at earlier with the stuff about ideology and culture, and where he develops his idea of restrictive and inclusive historical materialism to try to answer to it. So there are some Marxists who think that historical materialism is a theory of everything, essentially, right? You can explain conscious thought by talking about what the forces of production are, the relations of production, et cetera, et cetera. And, you can explain religion, morality, people's kind of everyday sense of right and wrong by looking at the economic base. That's the real foundation of society. And Cohen later became quite critical of these views, characterizing them as inclusive historical materialism, right? This idea that historical materialism has this extraordinary ability to causally explain all kinds of things that most people would be skeptical it actually can explain. And later, in editions of the book, he argued for, at least signed off on, an idea that he called restrictive historical materialism, which holds that historical materialism can explain a lot of phenomena, but to your earlier joke, it's not explained to you, why it is that you and your girlfriend had a fight yesterday, right? Maybe if it's because you don't have enough money because you're not getting paid enough for your job, there's some kind of currency you can get from it there. But by and large, you're on your own on that one. So if we could address those two problems.
Yeah, totally. Well, and the two are related, right? So because we say technological determinism, I mean, I think that this is like I mean, I think sometimes that word determinism is thrown around by a certain kind of academic as a kind of lazy way of rejecting whatever's being criticized, right? It's like one of these words like I don't know, dualism, right? My graduate school professor Simon Evnin, I remember once joking that it's like he doesn't know why so many continental philosophers have a problem with the number two, right? Are there never two of something, right? What's the why are dualisms taken to be so bad? But in any case, he has but when you say, like when you say, oh, this is technological determinism, and we're just sort of supposed to be like, ugh, determinism, bad, right? Well, why, right? There are a few possible reasons why determinism might be just sort of assumed to be a bad thing. One of them is that you think that it's, you think that like determinism sort of rules out, agency, free will. And in that case, I think if that's what you mean, then it's definitely an unfair accusation against Cohen's reading of Marxist historical materialism. Because, Cohen, if anything, I mean, like I actually think from what I can tell, believed in like a much stronger view of free will than I actually think is plausible. But the claim would be, right, to the extent that we're saying people's, like in the aggregate, right? Of course, obviously in any individual case, people have all kinds of motivations, but if you're going to and sometimes act very irrationally and et cetera, we all know this, right? But if you're saying that in the aggregate, enough people are going to be motivated by certain kinds of material factors that we can make these broad predictions about the relationships, about how the development of the forces of production will lead people to do things that result in new forms of society that further develop it, and et cetera. To the extent that we can do that, the claim is that people will do this of their own free will because it's in their interests, right? That you're saying, well, I think that people are going to be rational, therefore I think they're going to do this. There's no anti-autonomy, anti-free will sort of implication to that. But I think that the more plausible, another thing that people might sometimes mean by technological determinism is just, it's just a way of saying the no leapfrogging thing, but making it sound like a bad thing. But I actually think that, the 1859 preface is pretty vindicated there, right? By a look at like the actual history of attempts at leapfrogging. A third thing, though, that I think is the sort of most plausible criticism that might be lurking in accusations of technological determinism is, okay, you're saying that these material factors, so starting with the production, the development of the forces of production, and then going to the development of the relations of production, and then, get into whatever's downstream of that, you're saying that an implausible amount of history is explained by this. And if so, yeah, I mean, I think that depending on how you read what the original claim is, that might be a fair criticism. Cohen himself, I think is very characteristically in a very Cohen-y turn of phrase, is a bit coy about this. And I think this is in the original edition, but anyway, it's not in one of the new chapters, one of the old chapters of Karl Marx's Theory of History, where he says that this is not intended as a theory of everything that's ever happened. It's intended as a theory of the amount of history that we can have a theory of, which is more than none of it and less than all of it. Which is like, okay, thanks, buddy. That really cleared that up for me. But like, yeah, if you're gonna try to say, we're gonna have, we're gonna have a theory that's gonna tell you, why it is that, I don't know, why it is that obsession made more money than the new Star Wars, or that there's why it is that you got to fight with your wife.
I should say, as someone who watched the new Star Wars in theaters, my parents wanted to go see that. I don't really think that's much of an open question.
Yeah, it might not need historical materials to explain that. Yeah, so but I mean, I would even say, like, look, if you're trying to explain particular historical events in particular societies at a particular time, I mean, even sort of putting the jokey examples to the side and thinking about the kinds of things somebody might say, right? That historical materialism is good for, right? I think that if the claim is just, hey, the kinds of factors, forces, relations of production, the historical materialism emphasizes are ones that are going to be sort of explanatorily potent variables when you're looking at things like, I don't know, we're 2 days away from the 4th of July, right, in America's 250th. So things like why the American Revolution, broke out when it did, or like if you're trying to figure out, or if you're thinking about the English Civil War, or you're thinking about the World War I or whatever, right? Like if you're trying to figure out these particular historical events, if all you're saying is, oh, this is a big important factor that these intellectual resources give you some insight to think about, then sure, fair enough, right? But if you're trying to say, this is where I think the most plausible version of the technological determinism worry spills into the question that you wanted to raise about restrictive and inclusive. If you're going to say, oh, we can explain why all of those things happened, right? By, through this overarching theory of history, to me, that's pretty implausible, right? Because, I mean, and this is why...
And I should add, just to kind of defend Marx and Cohen here a little bit, I think that any theory of history that you try to develop that would have that, or you would attribute that kind of causal, unexplanatory power to, is going to be implausible, right? I mean, a lot of people have tried, and many people have failed to try to account for why the new Star Wars movie failed and why the Crusades happened, in the Middle Ages, and most of them end up reading pretty strange.
Yeah, exactly, right. So yeah, I don't think any yeah. To be clear about the sort of sweeping nature of the worry, I am skeptical that there's any plausible theory of history that will explain as much as all that, because and even the sorts of things that are like very, very much within the ambit of what historical materialism is classically interested in, right? Like if we're, the sort of like, yeah, why did the French Revolution happen or whatever, right? Like I think that I think that the more you zero in on specific events at specific times, the less plausible that gets, just because even if the factors historical materialism emphasizes are like interested, important, causally potent parts of the mix, I just think real history is way too messy and multi-causal for like any kind of like sweeping overarching explanation of this kind to tell you all of that, right? So I think the real question is like, what's the subset of that we're trying to explain, and if it's like this is why, so like there's something called the Brenner debate, right, among sort of Marxist and Marxist adjacent historians about the origins of capitalism in England and the sort of particular contingencies that caused the system to kind of get its first foothold in England when it did. And it seems like, I mean, my intuition about this for a long time has been like, look, if you're asking how capitalism was first born in England, then that seems like the kind of like really specific contingent local matter about which any kind of like grand, like anything at the sort of pitched at the level, the 1859 preface level, the sort of view from 10,000 feet grand overarching story, like just sort of expecting you'll be able to extrapolate an answer for that just seems kind of ridiculous to me. But if you're asking, hey, why is it that if you look around the world in 2026, it's capitalism everywhere, right? The relation of production that dominates nearly every society on the planet is workers and capitalists, whereas if you go back 1,000 years, it was feudalism everywhere, right? That feels to me like the kind of thing that you could have, that like where like sort of grand overarching historical theories have their place.
Yeah, absolutely. It's worth noting also that this relates back to Cohen's critique of what he later calls the obstetric vision or eccentric understanding of history, which is essentially that you can use Marx's historical materialism to make predictive claims about what is going to come. The most famous of which, of course, which is sometimes applied by Marx himself, being that socialism and communism are inevitable because the contradictions inherent within capitalism are going to lead to it dissolving. The expropriators will be expropriated, and then we'll move on to the ideal society where the free development of each becomes the condition for the free development of all. Right? Cohen never abandoned his commitment to historical materialism. We need to be clear about that. But he was very critical of this predictive, even teleological set of hopes that people sometimes ascribe to historical materialism, which, from their view, showed that socialism and communism were inevitable. One way or another, they were coming. You can maybe try to slow down the process a little bit, or you can maybe try to speed it up by giving history a little push, to use the famous Leninist phrase. But one way or another, the end result was inexorable. Cohen was very, very critical of that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's an interesting question here. I don't want to get us too far off topic, but like, I think that the question of whether there's some sense in which socialism is inevitable or even like quasi-inevitable, right? Because like even on the obstetric metaphor that Cohen criticizes in his later work, right, that the old society is already pregnant with the new one. It's just a question of giving birth to it, right? That so we could like speed it up or whatever, but like we can't, but like the direction of march is inevitable. Of course,
we're all just the midwives of history.
Yeah, exactly, right. So of course, classical, the sort of classical Marxist presentations of it do tend to build in a little bit of wiggle room for like, you could have a catastrophic collapse backwards, but like, but like, so it's in that sense maybe not inevitable that like, you could, you have your that you could just like collapse into barbarism or whatever, right? If you have a miscarriage, I guess, but to keep the metaphor going, but like, but more or less that the line of march is inevitable. And it's like, I think that the best way I can think about it, to be fair to inevitabilism about this, is that on a long enough time scale, like there are certain kinds of historical inevitability claims that I suspect that even like normie liberals who tend to roll their eyes at Marxist inevitabilism would endorse, right? Like just sort of think about, I don't know, think about like apartheid in South Africa. That system would be defeated at the beginning of the 90s. Of course, you know, I think any sane person would say there's like a lot of contingency there, but like I don't think most people, right, Marxists, liberals, conservatives, whoever, right, I don't think, I think most of us would agree that there's some sense in which it wasn't going to last forever, right? Like there's no timeline where apartheid lasts until the heat death of the universe, right? Like
Yes.
eventually, right? Eventually, you know, democracy, you know, was going to be achieved in those circumstances, right? So you might think that, like, by very rough analogy, that sort of given that you know, given that capitalism so poorly serves the interests of you know, the majority of the population, that even though there are tremendous collective action problems, political strategy problems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that like if you're thinking about like what happens in the next 100,000 years, bracketing environmental concerns about human survival in the next 100,000 years, but like if we get 100,000 years to play with, right, what happens the next 100,000 years? You might think that like it's, yeah, look, are we, you know, like over the course of however many attempts that you get in that time is maybe one, you know, like could there be some apartheid wasn't going to last forever in South Africa sort of argument to be made for historical inevitability there? Maybe, but I'd also say that if there is a plausible version of inevitabilism, it's not a very politically interesting or salient one, right? Because it's like, well, I don't, you know, like let's say there's some sense in which this sort of either progress to socialism or historical collapse prophecy is true over a sufficiently wide time scale. It's like, okay, but I'm not like, I'm not, I mean, I'm interested in politics right now. I'm not really that concerned about what happens in 100,000 years, right? So like, I think over any time scale that's like actually politically relevant, I think like the idea that you know, transition to socialism is inevitable just seems flatly wrong, right? It seems very contingent, and I think a lot of what Cohen is getting at with his criticism of the obstetric metaphor is, and this bridges the two subjects, right? His interest in the theory of history and his interest in normative political philosophy, you know, moral philosophy, is if you think it's inevitable, you sort of don't need to think that much about values questions because, you know.
And he points out correctly, right, that one could actually hold to the inevitabilitarian thesis, right, that socialism is coming, and see that as profoundly undesirable. A very good example of this would be Joseph Schumpeter, right? Schumpeter, you know, very famous, not quite libertarian, but libertarian adjacent economist, brilliant guy, there's no doubt about it. Very learned in Marx, said, I believe that capitalism is going to go, socialism is going to replace it. That's pretty much like just the way things are going to be. And Schumpeter thought that was going to be a disaster, right? That most of the things that made human life exciting and interesting, that are characteristic of capitalism, were going to be dissolved in the kind of gray socialist future of gulag bureaucracies that we are all facing, right? So inevitabilitarianism can be adopted by a lot of people, including, interestingly enough, by non-socialists.
Totally, yeah. I mean, look, yeah. I mean, I always think of the Ronald Reagan line in 1964 about how the Great Society was going to start us down the road to creeping socialism. We would have 1,000 years of darkness, and you know, of course, you know, I don't want to get sidetracked on this, but you know, but yeah, given my interest in thinking about how a feasible socialist economics could work, all I can ever think now when I think about that line, right, in the Time for Choosing speech is, wow, 1964, even Reagan thought that socialism would last well enough to last for 1,000 years, right? You know, that like it was you know, there was going to be that logistically effective, right? That's, you know, gotta recover that confidence now. But yeah, look, I mean, sure, you could just think like, yeah, I mean, you know, if you think yeah, that's the sort of classic description of conservatism is, standing athwart history yelling stop, right? You could think that like the attempt to forestall socialism is this tragic romantic doomed effort to save what's valuable in human civilization. Yeah, you could think it's a great tragedy, but yeah, I think that if you have like, so yes, you could think it's either socialism or barbarism, but still choose barbarism normatively, right? But if you have broadly left-wing values, if you're an inevitabilist about this, you might think, okay, like, if it's either we go forward in the only direction that's available to us, or we collapse into barbarism or whatever, that's like an easy enough normative choice that the values questions don't really come up that much. Whereas, if you think that it's not inevitable, then you have to think both about, okay, what's a version of it that could actually work, right? You have to think about the logistics, sort of engineering questions that Marx famously punted on, right, in the preface to Capital, right? It's not going to write recipes for the cookshops of the future, right? And you also have to think about the normative questions, right? What are the sort of values that are going to be relevant to us in deciding how we want society to be organized? If there's, instead of saying like, oh, there's like one possible future that society is already pregnant with, and we either go forward into that future or we collapse to the past, right? Then you don't you don't have to, I mean, by the time you're pregnant, the question of like what kind of baby you'd like to have is no longer relevant, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
you're either gonna have that baby or not, right? So it's where whereas, yeah, if we all get to, if we're lucky enough to be able to have socialism at all, if we have to figure out how we want it to work, then yeah, the engineering questions are back on the table. See the blueprint out from Verso, September 29th. But also the values questions are on the table. So see, probably much more than half of Cohen's overall lifetime academic work.
Well, this is a good place to transition then, right? So, as you mentioned, right, he was always concerned with the question of values and morality, made major innovations and contributions to moral philosophy even prior to the fall of the Soviet Union. But I definitely, to defend periodization a little bit, think that there's a change in accent and priority post 1991 that comes through very clearly in his discussions of the obstetric metaphor, which are quite personal and biographical. So Cohen mentions, to your point, look, for a very long time, socialists got a lot of gas out of the theory that inevitably socialism and communism was going to come, which means that we didn't really need to put questions of value on the table. And Cohen says, look, the fall of the Soviet Union ultimately doesn't discredit historical materialism. As we pointed out earlier, if anything, it actually affirms Marx's argument that there's no leapfrogging over the development of the forces of production in order to just have full socialism or communism immediately. History has to kind of run its course that way. But with the discrediting of socialism and the inevitabilitarian thesis by the fall of the Soviet Union, it's probably worthwhile for socialists to start to think about how it is that we can try to persuade people to adopt a democratic socialist framework, which is going to mean more stringently engaging in these questions of value. And Cohen is very clear. Look, socialists, even so-called scientific socialists, often like to claim that you don't need to involve yourself in these value discussions. But he says there was always kind of an insincere quality to this, since if you ask any socialist what they care about, they'd always say, well, socialism is going to be good because there's going to be more equality, more freedom, less exploitation, domination. You take your pick about, the kind of values that they would implicitly or sometimes just very explicitly but unselfconsciously invoke. So Christine Sipnowich, who's one of the contributors to our volume, has a very swell essay, makes the argument, I think, quite persuasively that unlike somebody like Nozick or Rawls, who we both dialogued with, one of the problems with talking about Cohen's theory of justice is there's not one big book that he produced that kind of puts it all together. The way that Rawls has a theory of justice where all the pieces are pretty much put together. You get the two principles of justice, the original position, the veil of ignorance, all that stuff. Or Anarchy, State, and Utopia, right? Where Nozick argues for, his libertarian theory of justice ends with calling it a kind of utopia. Instead, you get different contributions, different dialogues, different principles that Cohen argues for. But I think it's quite easy to kind of reconstruct his theory of justice by saying that these principles were meant to harmonize. And I think that, broadly speaking, there are three things that he thought democratic socialism would do, or three values that democratic socialism would embody better than any other system of political organization or economic organization. And these three principles were the principle of community that he defends in Why Not Socialism and other works. He also thought that democratic socialism would be a more free society, and he argues for this in essays like his famous Money essay or The Structure of Proletarian Unfreedom, which is probably my favorite essay by him. Maybe the Money essay would be up there. And then most centrally of all, of course, Cohen says that equality, which is probably the principle socialists care the most about, obviously a democratic socialist society is going to be a much more egalitarian society than most of the others, right? And I think this comes very forcefully through, especially in his gigantic book on rescuing justice and equality, which is a massive dialogue with Rawls and the liberal egalitarian tradition. So why don't we talk a little bit about why Cohen thought democratic socialism was what you should pin your hopes on if you care about community, liberty / freedom, and equality. Why don't we start with community, because I know you love that book, Why Not Socialism? It's your favorite work by his. You just constantly cite it all the time, never shut up about it. Why did Cohen care about community?
Yeah, I was on board until that last couple sentences. I think I do really like Why Not Socialism. I think my favorite book by Cohen is still probably Karl Marx's Theory of History, at least if we're excluding the essay collections, right? And yeah, as far as the essays go, I think that the two you mentioned, the Freedom and Money and the Structure of Proletarian Unfreedom, are absolutely two of the very best.
For those who don't know Cohen, I would actually recommend the Freedom and Money essay as a great introduction to his overall work, because it's very accessible. The point is taken immediately. It's very lucidly written. He has deeper essays and broader engagements, but if you're kind of Cohen curious, I'd start with that one.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one, just for absolutely general kind of political issues that are sort of interest to everybody, right? Regardless of views. And then I think the Structure of Proletarian Unfreedom is a really good one for people who are already interested in Marxism and kind of want to see what the kind of analytical rigor that Cohen is offering could bring, right, to Marxist analysis. Since it's basic, it's a extended kind of rigorous analytic defense of the idea that workers are mutely compelled to submit themselves to capitalists. That of course is very central to Marx. Okay. So yeah, starting with community is a little bit funny, because I actually think this is the one that in some ways he says the least about, but what he says about it is interesting.
Actually, that's why I decided we'd start with it, because I think we should end strong by talking about equality.
Sure, fair enough. So basically, when we get to the equality stuff, Cohen is going to have very specific views about what count as intrinsically unjust inequalities, right? About what it is that we should be trying to equalize, and what distributions of goods would pass that test. But then there's a sort of further question, right, about various kinds of material deprivation that might still persist anyway. Right, that doesn't necessarily violate the principle about equality for reasons that we'll see when we get to it, but that sort of still seem troubling, right? That so if somebody presumably it's very easy to imagine a society in which we've eliminated the sort of broad structural sources of social inequality, and it's sort of not obvious that anybody who still does badly is the victim of injustice exactly. But we can still imagine people doing very badly for other reasons. People make foolish decisions. I myself have made a foolish
I've never
decision
known people to do that.
on once or twice in my life, right? And
I've known you to make foolish decisions once or twice in an hour, actually. Usually when we're out late at night.
Sure. Yeah, right. So yeah, given that, right? Like, it's easy to imagine situations in which people end up in bad places in their lives, not because they're a victim of some sort of social inequality or injustice, but just because they fucked up, right? And so the principle of community is going to come in there and say, yeah, but like, even if we're not talking about, about something that's like, an unjust inequality in society that you're a victim of, there's still a limit to how low that we're going to let anybody sink if we give a shit about them, right? As a person. And of course, interpersonally, it's, for particular cases, we all feel this way, right? That if I'll just pick my brother as an example, because this is going to be hilariously far from how he's actually lived his life, right? And say, like, let's imagine that my brother had like a horrible, crippling gambling problem, and maybe you think, oh, that's a compulsion, it's outside of his control, but whatever, forget that. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that like he's just making foolish decisions of his own free will, and he gave away like the deed to his house in like a poker game or something, and then so he's out of the streets. His wife is disgusted with him. She's taken the kids, whatever, like all that, right? And so I see him sleeping on a park bench. Right?
Just to put some meat on this bones. My buddy knew a doctor who, in the course of a weekend, in Niagara Falls, lost all of his life savings, lost his mortgage because he decided to try to get back his life savings by remortgaging his house, and it didn't go well. And then on Sunday, lost his marriage because his wife found out about all this, and needless to say, was not particularly happy about the choices he'd made over the previous 2 days. So not as speculative a scenario as some people might expect.
Sure. So if all this happened, and so he was sleeping on a park bench, and I passed by him, I wouldn't be like, oh, well, sucks for you, man. You should have made better decisions, right? So I think that certainly with with members of your family, with close friends, whatever, we all kind of take this for granted. But of course, because we live in a really unequal society where we all have to become pretty numb to this just to continue to function in that society. When it comes to strangers, that's not how we usually conduct ourselves, right? If you live in certainly any major city in the United States, right, and you walk a lot, right? I mean, you get used to walking around people in desperate situations and ignoring them, right? Because that's how what you have to do to function on a day-to-day basis. And even going back to like the French Revolution, right? The original bourgeois revolutionaries, right? The slogan was "Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité," right? So that last one, right? Fraternity, like brotherhood, or put more gender neutrally, community, right? Like is the basic idea that that some element of what it is to have a good society is that all men and women are your brothers and sisters, right? That you have that that you extend that you extend the sphere of your concern to everybody, right? So so Cohen thinks that even if people aren't victims of unjust inequalities, there's a socialist principle of community that would say that I mean, Cohen would also say individually, but I think certainly in terms of collective political decision making, that everybody in our society becomes part of the sphere of people that we give a shit about. And that like even if it's your own fault, right? You made foolish decisions, whatever. There's a limit to which we wouldn't let your life become worse than everybody else's, because you're within the sphere of our concern, right? as I said, Cohen doesn't say that much about this. He does make some sort of suggestive and interesting comments in different places, certainly in Why Not Socialism.
Well, I just wanted to make two quick comments on this, right? Actually, one quick and one relatively expansive. The first comment is some people could be critical of this idea of community by describing it as utopian, right? There's no world in which you're going to feel this deep sense of connection with people who are outside of your friends and family. But he points out that that's not true, right? One of his favorite examples in pointing out a comparatively recent society where people really did feel like they wanted to do their bit for their fellow citizens was the UK and other countries in the middle of the Second World War, right? Where he points out, even though it was wartime and obviously all kinds of horrible things were happening, many people in the United Kingdom were quite willing to do what they needed to for their neighbor, taking in their neighbor's children, staving off consumption in order to try to support the troops, all that stuff. And there was this sense in his terminology that everyone had to do their bit for the cause. And they were happy to do so. Now, Cohen isn't sitting there saying, so let's have a war or another war so that we develop or engender this sense of community. But he is saying, look, it's definitely not impossible. It might be difficult, but we've achieved it before in wartime. So wouldn't it be nice if we could induce similar kinds of sentiments in peacetime, right? Where we might actually have the resources to secure for everyone a reasonable quality of life. But the second thing that I wanted to bring up, and this is why I think I like this book a little bit better than you, and if I were to rewrite it, I would add this element in, is conservatives have often tried to monopolize the language of community for their own purposes, right? Suggesting that a certain sense of cultural homogeneity, a sense of the people sharing your values, all of that is what's necessary in order to induce these feelings of community. And it's what liberalism and socialism lacks in a certain fundamental sense. And what I really like about this book is Cohen provides a lot of ammunition for socialists to respond by saying, do you really think that you are your brother's keeper if you sit there and you pass by him on the street and you don't put a buck in his hat, but you say, I still feel a sense of connection for them because he probably holds good Christian values and I admire and I praise that. What Cohen really directs our attention to is how community has a material quality to it if it's going to be authentic. You can't say that you care about other people in your community if you're just going to walk by them and not give them a little bit of help if they need it, not do your bit for their well-being. And in that respect, I think socialism offers a much more deep sense of what it means to be part of community with other people than conservative ideas of community, which are inherently idealistic, right? We just share the same values. But ultimately, I'm going to live in my house, you're going to live in yours. And if you come by asking me for my hose, I'm just going to tell you to fuck off or pull yourself up by your bootstraps and buy one yourself.
Yeah, right. So when Cohen talks about this in Why Not Socialism, and also in a really interesting essay he wrote for the New Left Review, as the Soviet Union was breaking up, and he was sort of using that to reflect, right, on sort of socialist ideals, and and the kind of case for doing the try again, fail better, stuff. He says some really interesting things about it there. And so the value of community is, like as he sees it, is about sort of non-market relations between people who value each other, and of course, you don't want to be a sucker, right? You're doing your bit to help other people, and they don't care about you, but you don't, but community is not supposed to be transactional, right? You're not doing something for people in the hopes that that you'll get something back, but rather. It's there's a different kind of non-market reciprocity here, which to be fair, I think that this is why people, regardless of their political or economic views, right? This is one reason why people value family and friendship so much, because like these are spheres of people's lives where you do feel this strong sort of non-market kind of reciprocity.
The example I give to my students when discussing this book is he gives the camping example. I don't particularly like camping, and apparently Cohen didn't either. Is a tailgate, right? You know what I mean? probably a useful example to give now since everybody's very FIFA'd up, right? Look, you go to a tailgating party, everyone's expected or everyone hopes that you're going to bring a case of beer, you're going to bring a bit of food, and they can take from the common pool as they wish. But the idea then is that if your aunt makes some amazing pulled pork, right? You don't need to go over and exchange with her by saying, look, you give me a pulled pork sandwich in return, I'll give you a pale ale, right? She's just going to sit there and dole it out for everyone because she loves you, and she's going to make sure that it's good pulled pork because she wants everyone to be happy, right? And most people, and this is Cohen's point, find these kinds of solidaristic forms of reciprocity a lot less alienating and a lot more edifying than capitalist forms of transaction, again, where you go up to your aunt and say, I want a pulled pork sandwich, and in return, I'm going to give you X amount of beer, or X amount of dessert, or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so yeah, yes. Cohen's classic example of it, book I do still like very much. Why Not Socialism is, he starts out talking about camping trips, and crucially, this is the point that I think some of the more oblivious readers have managed to miss. What he's described in the beginning is just a normal camping trip of the kind that happens, a million times a day in the real world. And he's describing how normal camping trips work, right? That if everybody is pooling together resources, if you're like some people on the camping trip go fishing, and then they fry it up, somebody fries it up that night at the fireplace, right? There's no sort of this person deserves more fish than this person, because of what they did or did not contribute today, right? We that's not how it works. And then he sort of imagines a hypothetical version of the camping trip according to capitalist principles, and describes how intolerable that would be, right? People sort of start asserting property rights, of the kind that libertarians will want to defend, and that would be totally odious behavior. In the Back to Socialist Basics essay, he gives Steve Paxton, who's in the book with a really interesting essay defending Cohen's version of historical materialism, and he was also he didn't finish, but he was a student of graduate student of Cohen's. He had a couple years ago he gave me this camping mug that he'd had a friend of his who makes the stuff bake, that I've still got, that has the cover of Why Not Socialism. So it's like, okay, it's like a tin camping mug. It's covered in Why Not Socialism, which is cool enough. But then on the back of it, it's got the quote where Cohen says, "No, I myself do not enjoy camping." Right? I'd much prefer to do my socialism in the common room at Oxford or whatever. But yeah, in the Back to Socialist Basics essay, if you do not enjoy camping, an example you might find more relatable is he gives the example of the contrast between friends out at the bar informally alternating rounds of drinks, right? It's like, oh yeah, I got you, I'll give you the next round or whatever, as opposed to keeping track to the penny of who owes what to you.
And as somebody who's been in that circumstance many times, I can't say that nothing ruins a good bar night more than somebody coming up to you, or you going up to someone for that matter, being like, hey, I think that the beer I got you was $7, and the beer you got me is $6. So maybe Venmo me that extra $1. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, so I wrote an essay on my Substack a couple of years ago called "Why G.A. Cohen Would Have Hated Venmo." That was, because of course it is a technology that exists precisely to insert like market relations into those kinds of transactions. And although it's also really funny, there's the essay ends with a little coda that, like, as I was finishing up writing it, my former neighbor in Rosarito, right, another American who lived there, not Jason, but a different former neighbor was, I'd like plans to hang out with him that night, and he was coming back from San Diego. He was gonna stop at the liquor store and pick something up. And since I was suggesting, oh, actually, you want to, like, rather than what he was going to do, it was like, it's like, oh, actually, you want to pick up a bottle of whiskey? And I thought, it's like, I'm like asking to buy something a little bit expensive. So habit kicked in. I was like, oh, I can totally Venmo you half of it. And and my neighbor, who's far from being a socialist writer, is like, that dude has crypto investments, right? Was just immediately like, what? No, I'll just get it next time, right? So he did a better job in his own life of honoring this than I sometimes have. But yeah, right. So this is, and so of course all these are examples about individual behavior. There are something you talk about in your essay in our collection. Is, I think one of the criticisms of Cohen's normative views that I'm most sympathetic to is the sort of blurring together of morality about individual behavior with normative political philosophy, right? Sort of like what counts as justice for institutions, right? But certainly, when you think about the kind of society that you want to live in on an institutional level, right? Like, if you think, okay, look, I am cautiously optimistic that if we lived in a much more egalitarian economic order than you do, that we could actually get to the point where, on an individual level, if you saw somebody sleeping in the streets, that would be a crisis for you, right? Like it would be like seeing somebody having a heart attack, right? They'd be like, you'd be like, oh shit, what happened? Can I do something, right? I think that would be a much healthier way for us to interact, with our fellow citizens. And, but like also I think being psychologically realistic, right? Humans are partial creatures. I don't think that you're going to care as much about a random stranger, right, as you would about a member of your family, et cetera, et cetera. So like,
there's also moral exhaustion. That's simply a reality, right? I mean, at some point, people's altruism tank runs empty, and there's also good reasons for people to look after themselves. I mean, we've all met that friend who's self-effacing and self-sacrificing to a fault, and you'll sometimes think to yourself, like, look, man, maybe rather than helping out your buddy the 5th time or going to your mom's for the 8th time this week to help her turn on a faucet, you should look after yourself a little bit, and that might even be beneficent for everyone, who cares about you. So that's my Jordan Peterson moment.
No, I mean, I think that's totally true. Right? I mean, it's like, and look, I mean, part of the point about London under the Blitz and all that is that was an unusual event, right? That's a state of emergency. So yeah, I think that the moral exhaustion point is a real one. I think the sort of like psychological limits of this, I think, somebody says in the chat, totally true, right? You can't dictate care, right? So, in other words, I think that if we're having this discussion at the level of individual behavior, I think there's some real limits here. But I think that if we're thinking about what count as good political and economic institutions, then I think this becomes much more relevant again, right? That I want to live in a society that, on an institutional level, treats everybody under its jurisdiction as within the sphere of the people that we actually give a shit about, right? So we're not going to somebody's like, I mean, like, if somebody's shooting up on a park bench, right? We're gonna like. We're neither going to like just kind of institutionally let them keep doing that, nor sort of just like send in the cops to do a sweep and like, let them figure out, where they're going to sleep instead, but you can't sleep here, right? We're going to like get them into a rehab facility and, make sure that they have someplace to live after that, and, and all of that stuff. And I do think that some of the Cohen stuff about the socialist value of community does, a nice job of capturing those sorts of intuitions.
Yeah, and I think that one of the reasons why I think people have struggled with responding to this essay, particularly on the right, is I think that he's just undeniably right about 2 key points, right? Which is, first off, people do genuinely find these kind of solidaristic relationships more endearing and less alienating than capitalist relations. Now, whether you can extend them into the broader social sphere is, of course, the million-dollar question. But once you grant that point, it does suggest that we might be happier if we were to extend them, at least to the extent that's possible. And then the second point that I think he brings up in his point about community is, again, the idea that community has a material basis to it. It's not just about sharing abstract values with someone else, or even sitting on the same church pew as them on Sunday, the way that conservatives will sometimes argue. It actually means, to your point, if someone in your community is suffering or going through a hard time, you should probably help them out. And that actually might mean getting off your ass and doing something for them that materially makes them better off. Of course, with the understanding, or at least the hope, that they are going to do the same for you in the future. And I think that this much richer understanding community that has a material basis than what you find in conservative conceptions of community is one of the reasons why socialism is inherently a much more sociable philosophy than a lot of its competitors. So why don't we move on now to talking about how much time do you think we have?
Yeah, not much. We should move towards wrapping up, but we should let's spend. Why don't we just kind of very briefly hit freedom, and then maybe expand a little bit more for equality, but try to keep both of them pretty short, and try to wrap up by like a quarter past the hour.
Okay, that sounds good to me. So Cohen talks about freedom in a lot of different places, and going all the way back to Marx, there's a long socialist tradition of advocating for freedom, emancipation, non-domination, all these good things, right? I think that his three key works on this, although there are more, are two that we've already signposted: The Structure of Proletarian and Freedom essay, Freedom and Money, which is a very interesting one, and then his very extensive critique of Nozick and self-ownership, freedom, and equality. So there are a lot of different arguments that appear through his oeuvre that talk about freedom. I'll just bring up two of them here, and then maybe do you want to talk about the money essay?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So Cohen is very critical of Robert Nozick, even though he admires his work, saying that Nozick awoke him from his dogmatic socialist slumber, kind of a gesture there to Kant and Hume. And the reason is, he says that what Cohen notices is that there's a strange affinity between libertarian arguments about self-ownership and how you acquire property through labor, and socialist arguments about how the working class is being exploited and is rendered unfree as a consequence of having to sell its labor to capital as part of this exploitative domineering process. And Cohen offers, as you point out, a huge number of objections to Nozick, many of which are very powerful, some of which I think are less persuasive. But I think the one that resonated the most for me is what Cohen points out, is that the freedom that is offered by capitalism is a very narrowly circumscribed freedom that is only of benefit to a very small number of people, which is something that Paxton also brings up in his book on capitalism, inspired by Cohen. One kind of particularly vivid example of how Cohen criticizes Nozick is he points out that for Nozick, there's nothing inherently wrong about a billionaire lighting a cigar with a $5 bill in front of a starving child, because from Nozick's standpoint, that $5 belongs to the billionaire, and he should be free to use it as he wishes, because even though it might be a nice thing for the billionaire to give the $5 to the child doesn't have any kind of entitlement to that billionaire's money. And if he just happens to like the taste of a crisp $5 bill on a cigar, rather than giving it to the child, then so be it, right? And I think the kind of moral point that Cohen is getting at here is very, very clear, right? There's something that's deeply obscene about any notion of freedom that leads you to the conclusion that there's nothing inherently wrong, even if there might be something unvirtuous about billionaires lighting their cigars with $5 bills while there are starving children in front of them who would be very, very, very much helped and probably emancipated through possession of that $5 bill. But the one that I wanted to focus on a little bit more is his seminal essay on the structure of proletarian and freedom, because this is there's a very rich essay. There's a lot of dimensions to it, but at its core is a very simple thought experiment that's directed against what we may call the social mobility argument that some more sophisticated conservatives will use to try to defend basically capitalism and wage labor relations. So our hypothetical capitalist makes this argument saying, look, yes, it might be the case that people who are in wage labor contexts are unfree, because they have to sell their labor to a capitalist in order to receive a living wage and sustain themselves. Yeah, that's definitely a sense in which that this could be felt to be unfree. But the reality is that if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you save your pennies, you're talented and you work hard, you could send your kid to university or you go to university, eventually you can rise up out of this kind of situation, and then you'll be free, right? You're no longer trapped in this wage labor relationship. And Cohen offers a very vivid thought experiment to be critical of this idea. He says, let's imagine that there are 10 people locked in a room. There is a single key on the floor, and any one of these people can pick up that key, use it to exit the room, and then they're no longer be imprisoned. But the minute that person uses that key, all the rest of the 9 remain imprisoned. And Cohen says, would we say that every person in that room was free just because any one of them could potentially use the key to escape? Cohen says that would seem to be pretty absurd, right? And the reasoning here, I think, is pretty clear. If you hold that, it's pretty absurd to say that just because one person can escape the room, all of them are functionally free because it could be any one of them. Then equally, it should be very, very transparently absurd to say, well, just because the odd person is able to escape the wage labor relationship, everybody who's subject to the wage labor relationship is functionally free because any one of them could potentially escape it and end up being a capitalist or rich enough to engage in kind of hedonic pleasures to their satisfaction. And I think this is a very powerful critique of these kinds of meritocratic social mobility arguments, because it really displays not only kind of the vulgar consequences of adopting this reasoning, but just how absurd on the face of it is to say that a wage laborer is free or functionally could be free just because they have the potential of one day escaping that, even though the vast majority of people we know, as a matter of fact, are not going to.
Yeah. And so one of the things that he says at the beginning of that Structure of Proletarian and Freedom essay, there's this very nice sort of refutation in passing of Robert Nozick, because Nozick, like many libertarians, is a little bit squirrely about how he defines coercion, right? And Nozick says that you're you're only coerced if your rights are being violated, right?
Yeah.
So
even if you have no choice but to do something, unless somebody is directly forcing you to do it, you're still free.
Sure, and in fact, I mean, on the crucially, right, for setting up the Freedom and Money essay, on Nozick's view, even if you are being directly forced, it's still not unfreedom, right? It's still not coercion. I
should add that Hayek makes a very similar point in the Constitution of Liberty, where he says, "Look, if you're hanging on a cliff and you're grabbing onto a branch." Even if you have no choice but to climb that branch, you're still functionally free because no one is coercing you to climb that branch unless you want to, right?
Yeah. But again, on the Nozick way of using the word coercion, even if you are being directly forced, you have that doesn't mean, right, that doesn't count as coercion, that doesn't count as unfreedom if you don't have a right to do the thing you're being forced not to do, right? Or you don't have a right to not do, right, the thing that you're being forced to do, right? So if you, because of course, I think Nozick is a smart enough guy that he can see coming a mile away, right? That if we're just going to sort of have a way of talking about freedom that's like, oh, freedom is freedom from coercion, then wait a second, what about what about all of the coercion that's necessary to enforce property rights, right? And so Nozick wants to say that doesn't count, right? So from the beginning of that Structure, Proletarian and Freedom essay, Cohen writes, Robert Nozick might grant that many workers have no acceptable alternative to selling their labor power, and he recognizes that they need not have an alternative at all in order to be they need not have no alternative at all, nor not in order to not be counted as doing so. But he denies that having no acceptable alternative to do A entails being forced to do A, no matter how bad A is, no matter how much worse the alternatives are. Since he thinks to have no acceptable alternatives means to be forced only when the unjust actions help explain the absence of acceptable alternatives. Property distributions reflected a history of acquisition and exchange may leave the worker with no other acceptable options, but nevertheless not forced to sell his labor power if the acquirer and exchanged it were free of injustice. Nozick's objection to the thesis under examination rests upon a moralized account of what it is to be forced to do something. It is a false account because it has the absurd upshot that if a criminal's imprisonment is morally justified, that he is not forced to be in prison. And this is going to be really important for the point of the Freedom and Money essay because once you say, okay, look, whether you're being coerced into doing something or not is a separate question from whether the coercion is justified, right? Like you can, there could just be a fact of the matter that you are being forced to do something or not to do something. And we can acknowledge that fact of the matter and then have a moral discussion about whether the coercion, is just or unjust or whatever. Then this really complicates the conception of freedom favored by capitalism's defenders. So in Freedom and Money, right, the essay is written in memory of Isaiah Berlin, who was a very important academic mentor of Cohen's, somebody who obviously deeply disagreed. Cohen obviously deeply disagreed with his views, but he learned a lot from him, and had a very rich intellectual relationship with him. There's also, by the way, if you read the Cohen, one of the posthumous collection of Cohen's essays, Finding Oneself in the Other. The first essay there is called Isaiah's Marx and Mine. Is really good. It's sort of about his arguments, the arguments that he would have over the years with Isaiah Berlin about Marx. But in this case, he's trying to think a little bit more broadly about the difference between their views. And he says he says in that essay that he describes these, he describes this typical libertarian argument where there are what he just says are two sort of movements of the argument. One is that left-wing redistributive economics in any form ranging from mildly social democratic tax and transfer to expropriating the means of production violates freedom from interference. And
just some people might be familiar with this principle as articulated online as the non-aggression principle, is what libertarians will usually call it nowadays.
Yeah, right. Basically, yeah. So this is the and then the second move of the argument is to say, well, therefore it's unacceptable. Whereas good liberals like Isaiah Berlin, who are okay with sort of New Dealish economic policies. Berlin, was surely all in favor of the NHS in Britain, all of that stuff. So he would say, okay, yes to the first part, no to the second part, right? And so yes, this is a violation of freedom from interference. Yes, that's bad, but maybe on the sort of overall judgment, right, as we balance different values against each other, a certain amount of violation of freedom from interference is acceptable for the sake of greater values, right? I mean, that would be the sort of moderate liberalism of somebody like Isaiah Berlin. And the really interesting thing that Cohen does in that essay is he says, no, I want to argue about the first part. Right? I mean, forget whether or not you think that the second movement of the libertarian argument is correct. I want to talk about the first part because he wants to challenge this basic idea, right? So there's this very common perception that defenders of capitalism are people who really care about what's sometimes called negative freedom, right? Freedom from interference, freedom to not be stopped as you do what you want to do. whereas they might not care so much about positive freedom, where positive freedom might be like, you're like have to, or certainly positive rights, right, would be like not your right to not, a negative right is a right to have people not do certain things to you. A positive right would be a right to have people do things for you. And so the sort of usual perception is that pro-capitalist people are, really care about negative freedom, negative rights, whereas the further you get to the left of that, the more interested you are in positive rights, and maybe in some sort of conception of freedom that's richer, more interesting, or diverges from this kind of negative freedom from interference. And Cohen's basic move is to say, well, hold on, though. Let's think about that, right? Because if you want to say, well, all right, the reason for like left-right disagreements about economics is an argument about whether we should prioritize freedom in this negative freedom sense more or equality more, right? Cohen wants to basically say, no, actually, economic inequality means that you have unequal freedom from interference. That because, the sort of basic move he makes, I mean, this is, if you're sort of familiar with like, 2020's internet leftism, you have, which, I know you laugh when I say that, because usually when I use phrases like that, I'm about to shit on it, but like I'm not in this case.
That's where I thought this was going, but
yeah, in this case, I'm talking about something that I like, right? Which is, actual unironic friend of the show, Matt Brunig, is very fond of this kind of argument. I don't know if he got it from Cohen originally or it was just parallel tracks of thinking, but like basically the point that that I think I've seen Matt make a million times is a point that Cohen is making an early version of, right, much earlier in this Freedom and Money essay, which is, wait a second though, property rights are rights to interfere, right? That's what a property right is. You can stop other people from using them. A distribution of property is nothing but a distribution of rights to interference. A no trespassing sign is every bit as much of a threat to use coercive interfering force as a letter from the IRS about back taxes.
And I should say, every time I bring this up to a libertarian as a critique of the non-aggression principle, they make the same kind of move that Cohen criticizes Nozick for making, right? Well, they say, well, but hold on, what we're talking about is you can't use illegitimate coercion.
Exactly.
This kind of coercion is legitimate because I'm protecting myself or my property. And of course, they will say the same applies to the state, right? Of course, the state should not use coercion to take my property, but it can use coercion to protect my property because that's legitimate. And to your point and to Cohen's point, he'd say, okay, but then we're not really arguing about whether coercion is going to be used. What we're arguing about is about what counts as legitimate coercion, which is a perfectly fine discussion to have, right?
Sure.
I happen to think that there are some times when coercion is justified and sometimes when coercion is unjustified. But we can't sit there and say that this is about whether we're going to use coercion or not.
Yeah, you and everybody else in the world, right? Because exactly. Outside of maybe the most fanatical religious pacifist, maybe, right? Like everybody, right, thinks that that there are legitimate instances of coercion, illegitimate instances of coercion. The argument's always about which is which, right? So that's exactly it, right? The sort of core of the point that that Cohen is making in Freedom and Money, the sort of core of the point that, again, like I think Matt Brunig has done such a nice job of making in many debates with libertarians more recently, is coercion is a red herring here, right? Because, we all agree that some sort of distribution of resources should be coercively enforced. We're disagreeing about which one that is. And so talking about the right to be free from coercion, well, if what you really mean by that, going back to the Nozick point, is freedom from, as you say, illegitimate coercion, then coercion is just a red herring, right? That like all of the actual heavy lifting is being done by the illegitimate part, right?
Absolutely.
So the real action is not at whether it's okay to take away stuff that people have a moral right to under like whatever the right principles are about distribution. The real action is always, what are the right principles of distribution? Because everybody would agree it's completely vacuous, it's trivial, that if somebody has a right to something, it's wrong to take it away. The issue is always, well, who has a right to it? And if you want to get to Cohen's views about who has a right to what, right? What counts as a just distribution? That gets you into what we saved for last, which is inequality, except that we have been going for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Should have been predictable. I was envisioning this as an hour discussion, but that was irrational on my part. So I think the move here is to pick a date very soon. We'll do that offline for part 2. Where we'll talk about Cohen's version of egalitarianism and debates about egalitarianism in general, which is...
And just a shameless plug, I should say, my own essay talks about Rawls's relationship to Cohen and essentially liberal egalitarians' relationship to democratic socialism, since both purport to be egalitarian doctrines, right? So I think there's going to be an awful lot that we can say about this.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like so I think that where Cohen's engagement with somebody like Nozick ends is where the interesting questions about egalitarianism begin, right? That, in other words, you say, okay, there is some sense in which we believe in equality, and so we don't just believe in letting the chips fall where they may in a free market. We reject Nozickian libertarianism. We think we think that the real question that matters is who has a right to what, and the sort of starting intuition for that discussion about who has a right to what is that there is some sense in which equality is valuable, and then you say, okay, but what do you mean by that? What's the kind of equality that's valuable? What's the what are the principles that should guide us here? And if these sound like minor questions easily dispensed with, then boy, do we have thousands of pages of Cohen responding to hundreds of thousands of pages of others to share with you, even without I assume that like it would be a huge violation of podcasting ethics to subject a non-consenting audience to extended discussion of expensive tastes. So we're not going to do that. But even without that, there is an awful lot to talk about here, and we will do that in part 2.
Left is best.
Yeah. So again, final reminder: the book out today is this thing, Analytical Marxism and Democratic Socialism in the 21st Century, revisiting G.A. Cohen. Pricing and academic publishing being what it is, I don't, I feel strange saying that it, telling anybody to go out and buy this thing. Although sometimes Palgrave does run sales. Keep an eye on the website for when it happens, right? And you can actually like snap things up at a cheaper price. But certainly get your library to order a copy for you, right? Good socialist solution, right? Get your library to order a copy, and do check out the book. Besides the two of us, of course, as the editors, and we both have essays in the volume. We have a wide variety of contributions from really cool people. Christine Sipniewicz was mentioned earlier. She wrote an important book about Cohen a little while ago. She has an essay in there. I plugged Steve Paxton's essay a little bit, but there's just a tremendous amount of good stuff from different contributors to this volume.
Excellent.
All right, so check that out. We will be back very soon for part 2. And yes, as Matt said, left is best.